Thanks for the vinegar, Dominic, my son-in-law, Richard said with a cold smile, dismissing the 50-year-old wine I'd gifted him at his birthday party. Then he leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. But you know what I really could have used? A signature on a power of attorney form. Now that's a gift that keeps on giving. The entire patio fell silent. My daughter Sophia's face went white with horror, but not because she was shocked by his cruelty, because he had revealed their secret too soon. For weeks they'd been playing the caring family, visiting more often, suggesting I see new doctors, leaving brochures for assisted living communities around my house. They thought I was a confused old man, losing his mind, easy prey for their scheme to steal my vineyard and turn it into a luxury resort. But what they didn't know was that I'd been watching, listening, and planning. And tonight, in front of all their friends, I was about to show them exactly who they were dealing with. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. The fog of a Napa Valley morning clung to the world like a soft gray blanket, muffling all sound except for the dripping of dew from leaf to earth. I breathed in the scent of it, damp soil, wet stone, and the faint sweet promise of the grapes that would soon be ready for harvest. My hand, wrinkled and stained from 70 years of life, ran along the trunk of a Zinfandel vine. Its bark was as rough and familiar as an old friend's handshake. This was more than just land to me. It was a living history book, and every gnarled vine a chapter written by my father and his father before him. My grandfather, a man with hands like leather and a spirit as stubborn as these California hills, had planted the first rootstock here with nothing but hope in his pockets. I walked the path his boots had worn smooth, past the low stone wall he built by hand, each rock a testament to his sheer will. My wife Elena and I had built our home on the rise, overlooking the neat rows of green. I could still feel her warmth beside me on mornings like this, could almost hear her whisper about how the fog made the world feel brand new. The vineyard held our memories, our sacrifices, our love. It was our sanctuary. The crunch of tires on the gravel driveway broke the morning's spell. I turned to see Richard's silver sedan, a car that always looked too clean for the country, pulling up to the house. My daughter Sophia emerged from the passenger side, her smile a little too bright. Richard got out his polished city shoes, stepping carefully onto the dirt, as if afraid to make contact. He was a man who measured the world in square footage and profit margins, a language my soul had never learned to speak. "Papa," Sophia said, embracing me. Her hug felt brief, a little distant. I noticed she didn't quite meet my eyes. "We didn't want to wake you." "I have been awake since the sun thought about rising," I replied, forcing a warmth I didn't entirely feel. "It is the best time of day." Richard clapped me on the shoulder, his grip firm but sterile. "Still at it, Dominic." "I admire the dedication," he said, his eyes scanning the vineyard, not with appreciation but with the cold, calculating gaze of an appraiser. He was cataloging everything from the old oak tree on the hill to the irrigation system we'd installed last spring. "This is a lot of land for one man to manage," he added, his voice laced with a casual practiced concern. Sophia nodded in agreement, a small worried frown creasing her brow. We sat on the porch. Elena had designed the scent of her rose bushes still hanging in the air. Sophia talked about her work, about my grandson Marco's school, but her words felt like filler, like the quiet before a storm. Richard steered the conversation exactly where I sensed he wanted it to go. He spoke of our neighbors who had sold their property, of the stresses of maintaining such a large estate, of the peace of mind that came with downsizing. Each word was a gentle probe, testing my defenses. "You know," Richard said casually, swirling the glass of water Sophia had brought him, "I had lunch with a zoning consultant last week. It's amazing what they're allowing developers to build around here now. Truly amazing." The sound of Richard's sedan faded down the long gravel drive, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I remained on the porch, the cup of coffee in my hand, having long gone cold. Richard's words about zoning consultants and developers echoed in my mind, not as a casual remark, but as a key turning in a lock I never knew existed. Suddenly, other comments from the past few months began to surface, small things I had dismissed as thoughtless chatter. Sophia mentioning how tired I looked. Richard asking about my insurance policies. Both of them insisting I see a new doctor for a comprehensive checkup. They were not random comments. They were threads, and I was just now beginning to see the ugly tapestry they were weaving. A disquiet settled deep in my bones. I got up and went inside, the familiar warmth of my home, suddenly feeling less like a comfort and more like a fortress under siege. To distract myself, I decided to tidy the guest room where Sophia had stayed the previous weekend. I stripped the bed, the scent of her perfume still faint on the pillowcase, a scent that now seemed alien and deceitful. As I gathered the magazines from the nightstand, a glossy brochure slipped out and fell to the floor. Its cover showed a group of smiling silver-haired residents playing cards on a manicured lawn. The title, in a serene blue font, read Golden Meadows, a premier assisted living community. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. The paper was thick and cold. Inside, pictures of sterile modern rooms and lists of amenities blurred before my eyes. 24-hour medical supervision, 3 chef-prepared meals a day, managed social activities. It was a sales pitch for a gilded cage, a place where people were sent to wait for the end. The brochure wasn't here by accident. It was a piece of reconnaissance left behind by an invading army. A cold stone of dread formed in my stomach. They weren't just thinking about my health. They were actively planning my removal. Later that afternoon, my grandson Marco arrived on his bike, his face clouded with a worry that was far too heavy for a 17-year-old's shoulders. He slumped onto a kitchen chair, avoiding my gaze. I poured him a glass of lemonade, my own hand unsteady. "Something is wrong, Marco," I said, my voice softer than I intended. He looked up, his eyes the same shade as his grandmother's, brimming with unshed tears. He fidgeted with a loose thread on his jeans. "I wasn't supposed to say anything," he mumbled. "Mom and Dad would be furious." "Whatever it is, you can tell me," I urged, placing a hand on his shoulder. He took a shaky breath, and the words tumbled out in a pained whisper. "They saw a lawyer, Grandpa, last week. I overheard them talking in Dad's office when they thought I was asleep. They were talking about your vineyard." He paused, swallowing hard. "And you." My heart hammered against my ribs. "What did they say, son?" Marco finally met my eyes, the anguish clear on his face. "Grandpa," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I heard them say the court would listen if they could prove you're not capable of making your own decisions anymore. Sleep was a distant country I could not enter." I sat in my worn leather armchair as the grandfather clock in the hall methodically chopped the night into useless pieces. Each tick was a hammer blow against the silence, echoing the single brutal word Marco had whispered: conservatorship. It was a clinical, heartless term for the theft of a man's soul. They didn't just want my land. They wanted my name, my mind, my right to exist as the man I had always been. They wanted to declare me an echo in my own home. The deepest cut, the one that bled the most, was Sophia, my daughter. I saw her as a little girl, her hands covered in dirt, as she helped me plant a new row of vines, her laughter bright enough to chase away the summer heat. I had taught her the names of the grapes, the rhythm of the seasons, the importance of patience. I had given her everything, and in return she was planning to erase me. I wondered when the daughter I knew had been replaced by this stranger, this woman, who could look at her father's life, work, and see only dollar signs. For hours, grief was a physical weight pressing down on my chest until it was hard to breathe. Betrayal was a bitter acid in my throat. I felt old, breakable, a relic to be discarded like the brochure she had left behind. This was their plan, to make me believe what they wanted the world to believe, that I was frail, confused, incompetent, that I was already gone. But as the first pale light of dawn began to ghost across the eastern hills, something inside me shifted. The grief did not vanish, but it began to cool, to harden. It was like watching hot iron being plunged into water. The passionate, chaotic pain was forged into something solid, something with an edge. It became resolve. They thought I was a dying tree, ready to be cleared away for their new construction. They had forgotten that the oldest trees have the deepest roots. They had forgotten that the wood from those trees is the hardest to break. I was not just Dominic, the old man. I was the guardian of this land, the keeper of my father's and grandfather's legacy. Elena's memory lived in these walls. My entire life was soaked into this soil, and I would not let them pave over it. I rose from the chair, my joints aching but my spine straight. I walked to the window and looked out at my vineyard, the rows of vines emerging from the darkness like a sleeping army. They were not just plants. They were my family, my history, my future. A cold, clear purpose settled over me. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a fight. They wanted to play a game of deception. Very well. I would play too. The morning sun did little to warm the chill that had settled inside me. I drove the short distance to Luciano's vineyard, my old truck rattling on the familiar dirt road. Luciano and I had known each other for 50 years, our friendship forged in the shared struggles and triumphs of turning this valley's soil into world-class wine. He was a man of fewer words than me, but his silences were always full of wisdom. I found him in his wine cellar, the air cool and smelling of oak and aging fruit. He took one look at my face and knew. He wordlessly poured 2 small glasses of his best Barbera, a wine too good for this early in the morning, and gestured for me to sit on an old wooden crate. "It is Sophia," I said the words, feeling like stones in my mouth. "She and Richard." I told him everything. The brochure, the whispers about my health, the lawyer, the final devastating confession from Marco about the conservatorship. Luciano listened without interruption, his dark eyes fixed on mine, his weathered face a mask of stone. When I finished, he stared into his glass for a long moment, swirling the deep red liquid. "The boy Marco, he is a good boy," was the first thing he said. "He has his grandmother's heart." He took a sip of wine. "As for the other two, they are fools. But a greedy fool is the most dangerous kind. I don't know what to do, Luciano," I admitted, the vulnerability raw in my voice. "If I confront them, they will use my anger as proof that I am unstable. If I do nothing, they will succeed." Luciano set his glass down with a decisive click. "Then you do not confront them," he said, his voice low and firm. "You do not show them your hand. You let them think their plan is working. You let them become confident, arrogant. Arrogant people make mistakes." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "You must use their own greed against them, Dominic. You set a trap, and you let them walk right into it, smiling the whole way." His words were like a lantern lit in a dark room. A trap. The idea began to take root in my mind, intertwining with the anger and the pain. How do you trap a man like Richard? You don't offer him what he needs. You offer him what he thinks he wants. My mind drifted to the upcoming date circled on my kitchen calendar, Richard's 50th birthday. A milestone. A celebration. The perfect stage. And then I knew the bait. I left Luciano's. An hour later, the path forward, no longer shrouded in fog. When I returned home, I didn't go into the house. I walked directly to my own cellar, the key feeling heavy and powerful in my hand. I descended the stone steps into the cool, silent dark. In the furthest corner, sitting alone like a sleeping king, was the barrel. The special vintage I had casked 50 years ago, the year Richard was born. A wine made from my father's oldest vines. I ran a hand over the dusty oak barrel, the initials of my father carved into the wood. This was meant to celebrate a life, I thought, a cold resolve hardening in my heart. Instead, it will mark the end of a lie. The following Sunday, my performance began. I set the table for our weekly dinner, my movements deliberately slower, a little more uncertain than usual. I could feel their eyes on me as soon as they walked in. Sophia's gaze was laced with a pity that felt like poison, while Richard's held a barely concealed impatience. They believed they were watching a man fading away, and every fiber of my being was dedicated to giving them the show they expected. We sat down to a roast chicken, the familiar aroma filling the dining room. I made sure to serve myself with a slightly trembling hand, letting a few roasted potatoes slip from the spoon onto the tablecloth. Sophia rushed to clean it up, her voice a soft, patronizing coo. "It's okay, Papa. Don't worry about it." I just looked at her with a vacant smile, playing the part of a man who was no longer in command of his own faculties. "So, Marco," I began, turning to my grandson. "How was the big soccer game on Friday? Did you win?" "It was great, Grandpa," he said, smiling. "We won 3-1. We continued eating for a few minutes in silence. Then I put my fork down, looked at him again with what I hoped was genuine confusion, and asked, "That's wonderful. So tell me about the game. Was it a tough match?" Sophia's fork clattered onto her plate. "Dad, you just asked him that," she said, her voice strained with exasperation. I looked at her, widening my eyes slightly. "Did I? Oh, I'm sorry, son. My mind must be wandering today." Across the table I saw it. A quick, almost imperceptible glance between Richard and Sophia. It was a look of shared victory, of confirmation. A flicker of triumph lit up Richard's eyes before he masked it with a placid smile. "It's all right, Dominic," he said smoothly. "These things happen." His condescension was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Later, as we were clearing the table, I began patting my pockets in a show of mild panic. "Now, where did I put them?" I mumbled, looking around the room. "I can't see a thing without my reading glasses." "They're on your head, Dad," Sophia said, the sigh in her voice unmistakable. I reached up my hand, feigning surprise as my fingers found the familiar plastic frames. "Oh, for heaven's sake," I chuckled, a hollow sound. Losing my mind. Richard didn't say a word, but his smug satisfaction was a tangible presence in the room. He was a predator who had finally cornered his aging prey, and he was savoring the moment. When they left that evening, I watched from the window as Richard placed a reassuring hand on Sophia's back. They were confident. They were certain, and that was exactly what I needed them to be. Every condescending word, every pitying glance was a nail they hammered into their own coffin. My feigned weakness was becoming my greatest weapon. As the weeks leading up to Richard's birthday crawled by, his visits became more frequent, his arrogance more pronounced. He would stroll through my vineyard as if he already owned it, pointing out areas where the guest villas could be built or where the infinity pool would have the best view of the sunset. He spoke of these things in front of me, assuming my mind was too clouded to understand the implications. I would simply nod along with a placid, vacant expression, all the while filing away every word, every gesture. My weakness had become his blind spot. The critical mistake he made came on a Tuesday afternoon. He and Sophia had stopped by, claiming they were in the area. Richard brought his laptop inside, saying he had an urgent work email to finish. "Just a few minutes, Dominic," he'd said dismissively, not even looking at me as he sat up on the dining room table where my family had shared meals for generations. I retreated to my armchair by the fireplace, pretending to doze off behind a newspaper. From behind the page, I watched him. His phone rang. It was one of his investors, judging by the deferential tone he adopted. He stood up, pacing as he talked, and walked out onto the porch to get better reception, leaving the laptop open and awake. In that moment I saw Marco, who had been quietly doing his homework at the other end of the table, freeze. He looked at the glowing screen, then at his father's back through the glass door, and then at me. His eyes were wide with conflict, but also with a sudden fierce loyalty. He gave me a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. My heart pounded in my chest, but my face remained slack, my breathing even. I was a statue, a piece of the furniture. Marco moved with the speed and silence of a shadow. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he angled it over the laptop. The soft click of the camera shutter was lost in the sound of Richard's booming voice outside. 1 picture, 2, 3. He captured screen after screen of charts, architectural renderings, and financial projections. Then just as quickly he was back in his seat, his textbook open, his head bent in study as if nothing had happened. When Richard came back inside, smiling and oblivious, he closed his laptop and announced it was time to go. That evening, long after the house had fallen silent, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Marco. There were no words, only a series of images. I opened them, the phone's light illuminating my face in the dark. There it was. The entire plan rendered in glossy corporate detail. Vineyard Resort and Spa. My home, my vineyard, my entire life had been replaced by sterile glass buildings and turquoise swimming pools. The betrayal was no longer a suspicion. It was a blueprint. Looking at the images on my phone, the cold corporate logos plastered over the land my father had bled for, I knew there was no turning back. "The trap is set," I murmured to the empty house. "Now I just need to wait for the rats to walk into it." The evening of Richard's 50th birthday arrived, cloaked in a perfect California sunset. Strings of golden lights were woven through the trellises on the patio, casting a warm, festive glow that felt like a well-crafted lie. Sophia had orchestrated everything, transforming my rustic home into the backdrop for a sophisticated Napa Valley party. Guests began to arrive, friends of theirs, from the city business associates of Richard's, all dressed in expensive linen and smelling of money. I watched from my customary chair, a quiet old man in the corner, a prop in my own home. Richard was in his element, the lord of a manor he did not yet possess. He moved through the crowd with a glass of champagne, his laughter too loud, his hand clasping shoulders a little too firmly. He was performing the role of the successful, magnanimous host. "Dominic, you're looking well," one of his partners commented, shaking my hand. "Richard tells me you've been taking it easy." "The vineyard is a gentle keeper of time," I replied, my voice deliberately soft and a little vague. The man nodded politely and moved on, having paid his respects to the relic. Sophia fluttered around like a nervous moth, her smile stretched thin across her face. "Papa, are you comfortable? Can I get you anything?" Her anxiety was a frantic energy just beneath the surface. She was desperate for this night to be perfect, to be the final convincing scene in their play before the curtain fell on my independence. My friend Luciano arrived and made his way directly to me, bypassing the crowd. He gripped my shoulder, his hand warm and strong. "It is a fine evening for a party," he said, his eyes meeting mine. In that single look, a volume of unspoken words passed between us. "Stay strong. The truth is on your side." I gave him a small, grateful nod. Marco stayed close to me for most of the evening, a silent, watchful guardian. He understood the stakes, and his presence was a quiet anchor in a sea of pretense. Finally, after the appetizers had been cleared and the wine had flowed freely, Richard tapped a knife against his champagne flute, calling for everyone's attention. The murmur of conversation died down. "Friends, family," he began, beaming as he put an arm around Sophia. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate this milestone. I feel like the luckiest man in the world." His gaze swept across the crowd and settled on me. "And I'm especially grateful to my father-in-law Dominic for hosting us in this incredible place. A place with so much history and so much potential." The guests applauded politely. I remained seated, my hands resting on the arms of my chair. The air grew thick with anticipation. The stage was set. The audience was captive. And the main actor had no idea what the final act held in store for him. As the applause for Richard faded, I slowly pushed myself up from my chair. Every eye in the room turned to me. The festive chatter ceased, replaced by a heavy, expectant silence. I was no longer the frail old man in the corner. I was the patriarch of this land, and my voice, when it came, was steady and clear. "Thank you, Richard," I began, my gaze sweeping over the guests before finally resting on him. 50 years. It is a significant journey for any man. It marks a point where we often stop and look back at the path we have traveled, and look forward to the legacy we hope to leave behind. I let the word legacy hang in the air for a moment. My father used to say that a man's wealth is not measured by the money in his bank, but by the richness of the soil he tends and the character of the children he raises. This vineyard is my family's legacy. It is not just dirt and grapes. It is time. It is patience. It is the sweat of my grandfather and the love of my wife sealed in every bottle we produce. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Richard's smile was fixed, but his eyes were hard. "A gift for a milestone like this should be something special," I continued. "Something that reflects the importance of the moment. It should be a measure of time itself." I turned and gave a slight nod to Marco. Understanding his cue, he disappeared into the house. A moment later he returned, his young shoulders straining slightly as he carried an ornate wooden crate. It was made of dark-aged cedar bound with brass fittings, and the old family crest was burned into the lid. He placed it gently on the table in front of Richard. A murmur went through the crowd. This was no ordinary gift. I placed my hand on the crate. "When you were born, Richard, 50 years ago, my father and I selected the very best grapes from our oldest vines, the ones my grandfather planted in 1925. We pressed them and put the wine into a special oak barrel to age. We made only one." I looked directly at my son-in-law, my voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying to every corner of the silent patio. "This is that wine. It has been waiting in the dark, breathing and maturing for half a century, waiting for this exact day. It is a piece of this family's history. It is my gift to you, son." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard stared at the crate, his face a mask of disbelief. He was a man who understood price tags and contracts, balance sheets and bottom lines. I had just presented him with something priceless, and in his stunned silence, I could already see the gears turning in his head, trying and failing to calculate its value. Richard blinked as if waking from a dream. A strained smile stretched across his lips, a poor imitation of gratitude. "Dominic, I don't know what to say," he stammered. The crowd, sensing a momentous occasion, leaned in closer. "Open it, darling," Sophia urged, her voice a nervous flutter. "Let's see it." With a visible effort, Richard reached for the brass latches on the cedar crate. They were stiff from 50 years of disuse, and he fumbled with them for a moment, his smooth manicured fingers unaccustomed to such resistance. Finally, with a soft click, the lid came free. He lifted it slowly. Inside, nestled in a bed of what looked like ancient yellowed straw, lay a single bottle. It was dark, almost black, covered in a thick layer of cellar dust and cobwebs. The label was faded, the elegant script of my father's hand barely legible. It looked less like a treasure and more like something unearthed from a tomb. I watched Richard's face. I saw the precise moment the performance shattered. The feigned awe in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a flat, cold confusion. He was a man who understood the labels of Screaming Eagle and Chateau Margaux wines that screamed their price tags from across a room. This bottle whispered a language he couldn't understand, the language of history, and he had no use for it. He lifted the bottle from its resting place, his movements clumsy. He held it up, not with the reverence of a connoisseur, but with the detached curiosity of a man examining a strange rock. His thumb brushed away some of the dust, searching for a recognizable name, a vintage, anything that would tell him its monetary worth. Finding none, a subtle sneer tightened the corner of his mouth. The disappointment was a physical thing, a souring of the air around him. He set the bottle down on the table with a dull thud that made several guests flinch. He looked at me, and his eyes were no longer those of a son-in-law, but of a hostile business partner whose time had been wasted. The silence on the patio was now absolute, thick, and suffocating. "Thanks for the vinegar," Dominic, Richard said, with a tight, dismissive smile, his voice loud enough for the closest guests to hear. The insult, so petty and so public, sucked the air from the lungs of everyone present. He wasn't finished. He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, cutting tone. "But you know what I really could have used is a signature on a power of attorney form. Now that's a gift that keeps on giving." A collective intake of breath was the only sound on the patio. The clinking of ice in a glass stopped midway to a mouth. Time itself seemed to have frozen, trapping us all in the ugly moment Richard had created. I saw Sophia's face drained of all color, her eyes wide with horror at what her husband had just revealed. Richard himself stood defiant, a smug curl to his lip, believing he had delivered the final clever blow in his quiet campaign. He had fatally underestimated his opponent. I did not raise my voice. I did not show the searing pain his words had caused. Instead, I let the silence stretch, letting his vulgarity hang in the air until it became unbearable for everyone but me. Then I smiled. It was a sad, weary smile, but it was a smile nonetheless. "You are right, Richard," I said, my voice perfectly calm and clear, cutting through the tension like a sharpened blade. Every trace of the frail, confused old man I had been playing for weeks was gone. "This wine is wasted on you." I paused, letting my words sink in. "It requires a palate that can distinguish value from price. It requires a soul that can comprehend legacy. You see a bottle of old grape juice. I see my father's hands in the soil. You see a wasted asset. I see 50 years of sunlight and patience captured in a bottle." I let my gaze drift from Richard to my daughter, whose face was now a mask of dawning dread. "You both have been so very concerned about my well-being lately, about my ability to make decisions, about the future of this land." Richard's smugness began to falter. A flicker of uncertainty, the first I had seen all night, entered his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to dismiss my words as the ramblings of a senile man, but I gave him no opening. "You mentioned a power of attorney," I continued, my voice as even as a stone. "You are correct. That is a far more practical gift for a man with practical plans." I pushed my chair back and rose slowly to my feet, no longer a tired old man, but the master of this house, the guardian of this legacy. I felt the weight of my 70 years not as a burden but as a mantle of authority. The trap had been sprung. He had taken the bait. Now it was time to close the door. "So let's talk about that power of attorney, shall we?" I said, looking him directly in the eye. "Let's talk about what exactly a man with your ambition would do with it. Let's talk about your grand plans." Richard's face, which had been a mask of confident disdain just moments before, began to crumble. I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his voice losing its confident timbre. "My only plan is to ensure you're taken care of." "Is that so?" I replied, my voice dangerously soft. "Let's see what your idea of care looks like." I turned my head slightly. "Marco." It was the only word I needed to say. My grandson, who had been waiting for this moment, stepped forward. He calmly took a small portable projector from a side table and connected it to his phone. He aimed the device at the large, blank stucco wall of the house. A bright rectangle of light appeared, silencing the nervous whispers that had started to ripple through the crowd. "Dad, what is this?" Sophia pleaded, her voice trembling as she looked from me to her son. "Stop this. You're confusing everyone." "No, my daughter," I said, my voice heavy, with a sorrow that was all too real. "For the first time in a very long time, everything is about to become perfectly clear." And then the first image flashed onto the wall. It was a title page designed with a sleek corporate font. Vineyard Resort and Spa, a proposal for redevelopment. Beneath the title was a date from 3 weeks prior, and below that the names of Richard's investment firm and a luxury hotel group. A collective gasp went through the guests. Richard froze, his champagne glass held halfway to his mouth, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. He looked like a man who had just seen his own ghost. Marco swiped his thumb across the phone's screen. The next image appeared, a stunningly detailed 3D rendering of a modern, sprawling resort. Glass buildings, manicured lawns, and sparkling blue pools covered every inch of the land where my vines now stood. My house, the house my father built, was gone. "This doesn't mean anything," Richard choked out, finding his voice at last. "It's just a concept, an idea I was exploring." "An idea you were exploring with Sterling Hotels," I countered, and Marco swiped again. An email appeared on the wall, the text sharp and damning. It was from Richard to a vice president at the hotel group. "Once the conservatorship is granted and I have full control of the asset," it read, "we can move to finalize the sale. The old man is showing significant cognitive decline, so we anticipate no legal obstacles." The final nail. The air was thick with the stench of his betrayal. No one was looking at the screen anymore. All eyes, shocked, disgusted, pitying, were fixed on Richard and my daughter. Sophia made a small, wounded sound in the back of her throat and sank into her chair, covering her face with her hands. I turned away from Richard. He was a stranger, a common thief caught in the act. His betrayal was shallow, born of simple greed. He was no longer worth my anger. My gaze, heavy with the weight of a lifetime of love and disappointment, settled on my daughter. Sophia was still huddled in her chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. She would not look up. She could not face the truth that was now projected onto the wall for all to see, the truth she had helped to create. The guests, who moments before were enjoying our hospitality, now averted their eyes. They instinctively created a wide, empty space around my daughter and her husband, a quarantine for the morally sick. I walked slowly towards her, each step an effort. My anger had dissolved, leaving behind only a vast, aching emptiness. This was the real wound. This was the cut that went straight to the bone. I stopped in front of her chair and looked down at the top of her head, at the familiar dark hair I had brushed when she was a little girl. "Sophia," I said, and my voice was no longer the voice of an accuser. It was just the voice of a father, a heartbroken father. "Look at me." Slowly, painfully, she lifted her head. Her face was a ruin, streaked with tears and mascara, her eyes swollen and red. In them I saw not the cunning of a co-conspirator, but the pathetic weakness of a follower, a woman who had allowed her husband's greed to poison her own soul. I gestured vaguely at the projector screen, at the cold, hard evidence of their plot. "He is what he is," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "He sees a beautiful thing, and his first instinct is to see how much it is worth. I understand that. But you grew up here. You planted vines with me in this very soil. Your mother's roses are still blooming because you helped me tend to them." I knelt down so my eyes were level with hers, forcing her to see the pain she had inflicted. The question that had been burning inside me for weeks finally came out, not in a roar, but in a pained, quiet plea. "And you, Sophia, you watched him plan to pave over your grandparents' memories. You were willing to trade all of this, all of us, for what I asked. A condo in the city." She had no answer. A raw, guttural sob escaped her lips, the only reply she could offer. And in that sound I heard the truth. She had traded her heritage for a fantasy of a life that was easier, shinier, and ultimately worthless. I stood up, the last of my strength spent. "Get out," I said, the words falling like ice into the silence. "Both of you. Leave my house." My final words hung in the air, irrevocable. Richard, his face a mask of white-hot fury and humiliation, grabbed Sophia's arm and pulled her roughly to her feet. She stumbled, still lost in her own private world of grief, and allowed herself to be led away like a sleepwalker. They did not look back. They walked through the crowd of their own friends and associates, who parted for them like the Red Sea, a path of shame opening before them. No one said a word. The only sound was the crunch of their footsteps on the gravel driveway, a sound of finality, and then the slam of a car door, followed by the squeal of tires as they sped away into the night. The party was over. The festive atmosphere had curdled into a thick, uncomfortable silence. The beautiful food on the buffet tables sat untouched. The wine in people's glasses went undrunk. The golden lights that had seemed so cheerful now cast long, somber shadows. My guests, the people Richard and Sophia had invited into my home, were now trapped in the aftermath of a family tragedy. One by one, they began to make their quiet exits. They approached me with downcast eyes, murmuring apologies and condolences as if someone had died. "We're so sorry, Dominic. Call us if you need anything." I simply nodded, unable to summon the energy for social niceties. Their pity felt like a shroud. I just wanted them to leave, to take their well-meaning whispers and awkward glances with them, and leave me to the silence of my broken home. Soon only two people remained on the patio with me, Luciano and Marco. The projector on the side table had gone dark, but the image of the resort was burned into my mind. The patio was a wreck, littered with the ghosts of a celebration that never was. Half-empty glasses, crumpled napkins, plates of cold food. It looked like a battlefield after the fighting was done. Marco came and stood beside my chair, his young hand resting gently on my shoulder. He didn't say anything, and I was grateful for his silence. It was a silence of solidarity, of shared understanding. He had been a witness to it, all the quiet hero in this ugly war. Luciano walked over to the table where Richard had left the bottle of 50-year-old wine. He picked it up with a reverence his own son-in-law had lacked, wiping the dust from its shoulders with his handkerchief. He held it up to the light. "A pity to waste such a thing on a lesson," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But some lessons are expensive." I looked at the bottle, at the dark liquid that held a half-century of my family's history. It had been meant as a gift. Instead, it had become a weapon and a mirror that had shown me the truth in the ugliest possible way. The next morning, I woke not with a heavy heart, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The storm had passed, and in its wake the path forward was unobstructed. There was no more room for doubt or sorrow. There was only what needed to be done. I called Luciano, who answered on the first ring as if he had been waiting. An hour later, we were sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Mr. Hayes, my family's lawyer for over 30 years. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had handled my father's estate and had drafted the very will I was now here to dismantle. I had called him from the road, and his somber expression told me he already understood the gravity of the situation. News travels fast in a small valley. Dominic, he began, his voice gentle. I was sorry to hear about last night. I held up a hand. Thank you, Arthur, but I am not here for condolences. I am here for surgery. I need to cut away a sickness before it can spread further. Luciano sat silently beside me, a pillar of support. I looked the lawyer directly in the eye, my voice even and devoid of emotion. I want to amend my will and all associated estate documents. Effective immediately. Mr. Hayes nodded slowly, picking up a pen. Tell me what you want to do. First, I said my daughter Sophia Moretti is to be removed entirely. She will inherit nothing. Not a single vine, not a single dollar. The words were harsh, but they felt necessary, like setting a broken bone. The same applies to her husband Richard. The lawyer's pen scratched across his legal pad. Understood. And Sophia's share. It was to be the majority of the estate. Her share and everything else will be placed into an irrevocable trust, I instructed. The sole beneficiary of that trust will be my grandson Marco. He will gain access to the funds when he turns 25, but the land is different. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the polished desk. This was the most important part. The trust's primary directive, its unbreakable rule, is that this vineyard can never be sold. It cannot be subdivided. It cannot be rezoned for commercial development. It is to remain a vineyard in our family's name in perpetuity. And who will manage it until Marco is of age? Mr. Hayes asked. I will, I said simply, and the trust documents will name Luciano here as the successor trustee should anything happen to me. He will guide Marco. For the next hour, we went over the details, the lawyer drafting the new language, ensuring there were no loopholes, no weaknesses that could be challenged in court. When it was all done, he printed the new documents. He pushed them across the desk, to me along with a pen. As I signed my name on the final document, the scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the room. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. I wasn't just cutting a branch from the family tree. I was pruning the dead wood to allow the healthy parts to thrive. I nodded slowly, my eyes still fixed on the bottle. An expensive lesson, I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. And a necessary one. I finally looked away from it and met Luciano's steady gaze. Thank you, my friend, for being here. Always, he replied simply. His presence was a silent promise that I was not alone in this wreckage. My gaze then shifted to Marco, who had not moved from my side. His face was a mixture of sorrow for what had happened and a fierce, protective anger on my behalf. He had seen the ugliness of the world tonight, an ugliness that had come from his own parents. Grandpa, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Whatever you decide to do, I'm with you. I'll help you. In his eyes I saw not just the echo of his grandmother's heart, but the strength of his great-grandfather's spirit. He was the future. He was the reason this fight was not just about the past, but about everything that was to come. He was the healthy branch full of life that deserved all the sun and water the vine could give. I know, son, I said, placing my hand over his. I know. Luciano cleared his throat, bringing me back to the cold reality of the situation. Grief is for later, Dominic, he said, his tone practical. Action is for now. They will not stop. A man like Richard, when cornered, does not retreat. He attacks. You must move first, and you must move decisively. He was right. The performance was over. The trap had been sprung. Now came the final necessary act of preservation. I thought of my vines in the winter, how I would walk the rows with my shears, carefully cutting away the dead canes and the diseased branches. It was a painful-looking process, a violent act upon the sleeping plant. But without it, the vine could not flourish in the spring. Without it, the sickness would spread and poison the whole plant. You had to cut away the dead wood to save the life within. A profound cold clarity washed over me. The path was not just clear, it was necessary. You're right, I said, turning to face Luciano fully. My voice held no trace of the broken man from an hour ago. It was the voice of a vintner, a farmer, a guardian. The sickness has to be cut out. I stood up, feeling the strength return to my legs. Tomorrow morning, Luciano, I declared my decision absolute. We go see Hayes. It's time to start pruning. The next morning I woke not with a heavy heart, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The storm had passed, and in its wake, the path forward was unobstructed. There was no more room for doubt or sorrow. There was only what needed to be done. I called Luciano, who answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting. An hour later, we were sitting in the mahogany-paneled office of Mr. Hayes, my family's lawyer for over 30 years. He was a quiet, meticulous man who had handled my father's estate and had drafted the very will I was now here to dismantle. I had called him from the road, and his somber expression told me he already understood the gravity of the situation. News travels fast in a small valley. "Dominic," he began, his voice gentle, "I was sorry to hear about last night." I held up a hand. "Thank you, Arthur. But I am not here for condolences. I am here for surgery. I need to cut away a sickness before it can spread further." Luciano sat silently beside me, a pillar of support. I looked the lawyer directly in the eye, my voice even and devoid of emotion. "I want to amend my will and all associated estate documents, effective immediately." Mr. Hayes nodded slowly, picking up a pen. "Tell me what you want to do." "First," I said, "my daughter Sophia Moretti is to be removed entirely. She will inherit nothing. Not a single vine, not a single dollar." The words were harsh, but they felt necessary, like setting a broken bone. "The same applies to her husband, Richard." The lawyer's pen scratched across his legal pad. "Understood." "And Sophia's share, it was to be the majority of the estate. Her share and everything else will be placed into an irrevocable trust," I instructed. "The sole beneficiary of that trust will be my grandson, Marco. He will gain access to the funds when he turns 25, but the land is different." I leaned forward, my hands flat on the polished desk. This was the most important part. The trust's primary directive, its unbreakable rule, is that this vineyard can never be sold. It cannot be subdivided. It cannot be rezoned for commercial development. It is to remain a vineyard in our family's name in perpetuity. "And who will manage it until Marco is of age?" Mr. Hayes asked. "I will," I said simply. "And the trust documents will name Luciano here as the successor trustee should anything happen to me. He will guide Marco." For the next hour we went over the details, the lawyer drafting the new language, ensuring there were no loopholes, no weaknesses that could be challenged in court. When it was all done, he printed the new documents. He pushed them across the desk to me along with a pen. As I signed my name on the final document, the scratch of the nib on the thick paper was the only sound in the room. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. It was done. The deadwood had been pruned. 2 harvests came and went, washing the valley clean with the turning of the seasons. The bitterness of that night faded not into forgetfulness, but into a quiet scar that no longer ached. The vineyard thrived as if breathing a collective sigh of relief. Without the shadow of greed looming over it, the vines seemed to grow with a renewed vigor. Under my guidance and Marco's boundless energy, we produced one of our best vintages in a decade, the wine rich and full of character, a testament to its survival. Marco was in his 2nd year at the State University, studying agriculture and business just as we had planned. But his heart remained here in this soil. He came home every weekend, not as a visitor but as a partner. The uncertain boy, who had secretly photographed his father's treachery, was gone. In his place was a young man who walked the rows with the confident stride of someone who belonged his hands, already learning the familiar roughness of the pruning shears, his mind sharp and full of new ideas that respected the old ways. News of Richard and Sophia came to me in fragments carried on the valley wind by Luciano or overheard in town. Their perfect life had unraveled with astonishing speed. They had divorced within a year of that disastrous party. Richard, I heard, had lost a significant amount of money in a risky real estate venture in another state and had faded into obscurity. His name, once spoken with a mixture of envy and resentment in the valley, was now met with a quiet, knowing shake of the head. He had built his life on a foundation of sand, and the tide had come in. Sophia had sent me a letter about 6 months ago. It was long, rambling, and stained with what I imagined were tears. It was filled with apologies, with blame for Richard, with pleas for a past that could never be reclaimed. I read it once, folded it, and put it away in a locked desk drawer. For my own peace, I chose to forgive her, but forgiveness and trust are 2 different things. A broken branch once snapped from the vine cannot be grafted back on, as if nothing happened. Some doors, once you close them, must remain closed to protect the warmth inside. My days settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. The frantic energy of the fight was gone, replaced by the steady, satisfying rhythm of the seasons. I was no longer just defending the past. I was actively cultivating the future. This evening, as the sun dips below the western hills, painting the sky in strokes of deep orange and purple, Marco and I sit on the porch. The day's work is done, and a comfortable silence hangs between us, the kind that only exists between people who understand each other without words. We are sharing a glass of our own wine, the Zinfandel from the 2025 harvest, the first one we truly managed together. It is bold and complex, with a hint of spice, a wine that speaks of a good year. I watch him as he stares out at the rows of vines, their leaves turning gold in the fading light. He is no longer a boy with a heavy secret, but a young man with a quiet confidence. I see in the line of his jaw the stubbornness of my grandfather, and in the kindness of his eyes the gentle spirit of his grandmother Elena. I see the culmination of a century of work, of struggle, of love for this land, all resting on his capable shoulders. And he does not find it a burden, he finds it a privilege. It was in that moment, with the taste of our shared labor on my tongue, and the sight of my grandson ready to carry the torch, that I finally understood. My entire life I had thought of legacy as something tangible, this land, this house, the name on the wine bottles. Richard had seen it the same way, as an asset to be liquidated. We were both wrong. I realized then that a true legacy isn't something you leave for someone, it's something you leave inside them. It is the knowledge passed down from a grandfather's hands to a grandson's six. It is the love of the land, the respect for the seasons, the value of hard work that sinks into your bones. It is the courage to protect what is precious, not because of what it's worth, but because of what it means. It is the story that is told long after the storyteller is gone. Richard and Sophia had wanted to inherit a property. Marco was inheriting a purpose. I had almost lost it all, not just the land, but myself. But in that terrible fight, in that painful pruning, I had been forced to discover what truly mattered. In the end, I had cultivated something far more valuable than grapes. I had cultivated a future. I raised my glass in a silent toast. To him, to this land, to the beautiful, peaceful closing of my day. 2 harvests came and went, washing the valley clean with the turning of the seasons. The bitterness of that night faded not into forgetfulness, but into a quiet scar that no longer ached. The vineyard thrived. News of Richard and Sophia came in fragments. They had divorced, and his fortunes had fallen. I chose to forgive my daughter for my own peace, but some doors once closed must remain so to protect the warmth inside. My days settled into a new rhythm, one of peace and purpose. I was no longer just defending the past. I was actively cultivating the future, watching Marco grow into the guardian this land deserved. He was not just my grandson, he was the next chapter. I had spent my life thinking legacy was something tangible, the land, the house, the name on a wine bottle. Richard had seen it the same way, as an asset to be liquidated. We were both wrong. I realized that a true legacy isn't something you leave for someone. It's something you leave inside them. It is the love of the land, the respect for hard work, and the courage to protect what is precious, not for its price, but for its meaning. Richard and Sophia had wanted to inherit a property. Marco was inheriting a purpose. In that terrible fight, in that painful pruning of my own family tree, I was forced to discover what truly mattered. This evening, as the sun dips below the western hills, painting the sky in strokes of deep orange and purple, Marco and I sit on the porch. A comfortable silence hangs between us. I watch him gaze out at the rows of vines, his silhouette framed by the fading light, and I see the culmination of a century of love for this land. I raise my glass in a silent toast to him, to this land, to the beautiful, peaceful closing of my day. What a journey we've shared today. Stories like Dominic's remind us that true legacy is measured not in acres or dollars, but in the values we pass down. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.